Hello, and welcome to the second in a series of 3 reviews of the Rareware Collectathon platformers for the Nintendo 64. If you haven't already, I'd recommend watching my review on Banjo-Kazooie before watching this, as much as what I have to say about Banjo-Tooie leads directly from my observations about its predecessor. Banjo-Tooie released in 2000 for the Nintendo 64. As the follow-up to what was still considered one of the N64's best games, expectations for Tooie were extremely high. Like Banjo-Kazooie, it became a commercial and critical success, and even managed to outsell Banjo-Kazooie by almost 1 million copies. Taking place 2 years after the events of the first game, Gruntilda the Witch has been unearthed by her siblings, and Banjo and Kazooie must put a stop to her plans. The opening cutscene, as in the previous game, is amusing, well-presented, and highly effective in its establishment of the game's tone. Aside from this, however, Banjo-Tooie's entire introductory section is far more lacking than Kazooie's. The problem with Tooie's introduction comes in 2 forms: tutorialization and pacing. Spiral Mountain, which once served as an extremely effective tutorial area, is a chaotic mess in Tooie, and not only in the sense of its newly disheveled layout. Tooie ends up being far less helpful than its predecessor in teaching new players how to play the game. Perhaps the biggest issue in this regard is the complete lack of player engagement and incentivization. The carefully crafted sequences from Kazooie that ensured and rewarded the player's understanding of the basic controls are nowhere to be found. Players that take the time to explore and experiment are rewarded only with a single collectible, and one that offers no immediate benefit. Even worse, the area contains a number of secrets that are only accessible through the use of moves learned later in the game, and some of these puzzles seem as if they should be solvable using Banjo and Kazooie's initial set of moves. As a result, players that do decide to explore Spiral Mountain are likely to be frustrated by obstacles they can't overcome. It's also worth noting that some of the game's basic mechanics have changed from the prequel. Swimming is slightly faster, Banjo's standing attack has changed, the running shoes allow Kazooie to run on water, and the beak bomb can be held to cover longer distances. This is all useful information that even experienced Banjo-Kazooie players would have no way of knowing, and its conveyance is basically non-existent. Obviously, not every game would benefit from a structured tutorial section like Banjo-Kazooie's, but for its own sequel to fall so short in this aspect is a little perplexing to say the least. In the first 5 minutes of playing Banjo-Tooie, new players have to learn not only all of the basic controls, but all of the moves taught by Bottles in Banjo-Kazooie as well. This is something I feel could have been handled a lot more gracefully. Instead of the previous game's prompt giving the player access to a more accessible tutorial mode, the game ham-fistedly throws all of the moves at the player in a giant optional text dump and pushes them almost immediately into a boss fight. In fact, the moment that the player steps away from Banjo's house, a cutscene is triggered directing the player to follow Grunty's henchman Klungo. Aside from being somewhat needless, interrupting the player with a cutscene directing them to the next area after they've had control for less than a minute is just one example of the intro's bizarre sense of pacing. To compare the pacing of these 2 games more directly, let's examine the period of time between starting a new file and entering the first main level. In Banjo-Kazooie, after playing through all of the tutorials, this ended up taking around 20 minutes. In Banjo-Tooie, it took over 40 minutes to reach the same point after skipping most of the tutorials. Nearly all of this difference is owed to the latter's heavy use of cutscenes. The opening cinematic alone is over 11 minutes long, more than 3 times the length of Kazooie's. What little gameplay there is within the first half hour is heavily segmented between lengthy story cutscenes and a great deal of exposition. Not helping matters is the new manner in which levels are opened. The jigsaw puzzle minigames are a reasonable attempt to add some variety to the process of unlocking levels, but they offer absolutely nothing in the way of challenge. Furthermore, when a puzzle is completed, the player has to sit through yet another set of cutscenes that are often over a full minute long. Considering that unlocking levels used to take a grand total of 12 seconds, it's difficult to see this new mechanic as anything but a step backward overall. There's nothing inherently wrong with placing a greater emphasis on the story, nor is there anything wrong with using cutscenes to present the game more artfully and cinematically. The issue here is the execution. Simply put, the first hour of the game is far too slow, bogged down with cutscene after diversion after cutscene. The meat and potatoes of the game are its levels, so the focus should have been to get the player up to speed with the game's controls and into the first level as quickly as possible. The majority of the intro's story cutscenes could easily have been placed later in the game, and possibly to much greater effect in the process. I don't want to drone on about the intro, so I'll discuss the game's story in more detail later on. For now, let's move on to the first main level, MAYAHEM Temple. Thankfully, the first level marks a considerable improvement over the rest of the game's introduction. Its design even seems to take some inspiration from MUMBO'S Mountain, using an obvious linear path that guides the player through the level while introducing various enemies, collectibles, and other game constructs along the way. Although the level isn't particularly large compared to others in the game, keeping things linear at first is a good idea, and prevents the player from being overwhelmed with an abundance of branching paths. As with the previous game, informational dialogue pops up as the player encounters new objects and items, allowing them to continue playing during the explanation, with one unfortunate exception. As the player enters the proximity of the first of Jamjar's silos, a cutscene interrupts, directing them toward it with a painstaking, sweeping camera shot. This kind of lazy conveyance would be annoying enough if it were a lone occurrence, but by this point Banjo-Tooie has used this technique multiple times, and adding to the annoyance is the fact that it plays even if the player is directly approaching the silo. Even ignoring simpler ways to convey the silo's importance, such as placing it in a more obvious location, it would have been trivial to move the cutscene trigger after the silo instead of before it, to avoid outright condescending the player. Although the cutscene is excessive, the first use of the move learned as a result of it goes to show that the game is still capable of subtle and effective conveyance. The snakeheads on the ground invite interaction by playing on the expectations of experienced Banjo-Kazooie players. When these players see a hole in the wall, their first instinct is typically to fire an egg. The placement of the other heads above the ground is a useful prompt that introduces a new dimension to the Banjo game's use of projectiles. The aiming mechanism is far from perfect, however. The control stick serves two functions simultaneously, moving the reticle around the screen and rotating the player's perspective when the reticle is on the edge of the screen. It seems strange that the C buttons went unused for this purpose, as aiming precisely at moving objects or targets on the edge of the screen can be difficult when the perspective unexpectedly changes. The use of the control stick does make sense in that the speed of the perspective rotation can be controlled more precisely than would be possible with digital buttons. A second analog stick would be ideal, but it's clear the developers had to make some sacrifice in order to make aiming functional. Despite its shortcomings, this new feature is fairly well attuned to the N64's controls, and its demonstration through this small puzzle familiarizes the player with it almost immediately. This is a mechanic that sees extensive use throughout the rest of the game, and its introduction is thankfully handled quite well. Two more new features of Banjo-Tooie are introduced in quick succession as the path branches off toward each of them. First, the player is able to play as Mumbo, the shaman who provided Banjo and Kazooie's transformations in the first game. This often provides a nice twist on the usual gameplay, as Mumbo's combat and movement abilities are extremely limited, but his magic alters each level in unique ways, and is almost always required for full completion. The design of MAYAHEM Temple also ensures that players will know where to go as soon as they take control of Mumbo, as the first Mumbo pad is placed in a very obvious location along the path. This also serves to demonstrate Mumbo's importance to the player, as nearly half of the level is inaccessible until the player makes use of him. The final branch of the path leads to TARGTZAN'S temple, which introduces the first-person shooter gameplay segments. Despite the risk inherent in such a dramatic change in core gameplay, the developers managed to make these segments work fairly well. The controls, while obviously not perfect, are as smooth and functional as one could expect from a console with only one analog stick. Although it can be difficult to aim precisely above or below the player's direct line of sight, the levels are often designed around this flaw. Targets that stray away from the axis on which the player fires are often large, with fairly generous hitboxes, and the few situations where this isn't the case are all in the untimed FPS section. Although it can be frustrating to miss a single target in the timed challenges, the gradually increasing tempo of the music is a brilliant design choice that helps to amplify the tension. The FPS sections do have some issues, however. Like its predecessor, Tooie makes use of sound effects to alert the player to the presence of enemies. But it's still very possible to be snuck up upon. The reduced field of view brought about by the first-person perspective is somewhat jarring and adds to the likelihood of a frustrating sneak attack. Sound cues are also used to indicate the proximity of targets. But confusingly, these sounds can often travel through walls, occasionally hindering more than they help. This is only made worse by the lack of a map or radar. A good effort is made to differentiate areas through the use of distinct colors for different rooms, but the overall layout is often difficult to discern, especially considering that all but the first of these sections are timed challenges that require the player to quickly and thoroughly search every area. In spite of these problems, however, the first-person shooter sections proved to be among the better of Banjo-Tooie's numerous departures from its 3D platforming core. MAYAHEM Temple introduces this new mechanic gracefully, allowing the player to take their time and learn the controls, and then follows up on that teaching with a fairly easy boss battle. Lastly, MAYAHEM Temple brings back the transformation mechanic with a few notable differences. The most obvious is the introduction of a new character, WUMBA. I appreciate the effort put forth by Tooie in introducing new characters when old ones would have worked just fine, though it's unfortunate that WUMBA represents a fairly dated and tone-deaf racial stereotype. Aside from this, the transformation mechanic proves to be an excellent addition to the game, far superior to its counterpart in Kazooie. The Stony transformation alters the player's size and controls, allows them to speak to certain NPCs, and grants them access to a minigame, demonstrating just how much can change depending on the player's current form. Every level now features a transformation, and all of them introduce their own control schemes and unique special abilities. This goes a long way to make transformations feel more significant and useful from level to level. Ultimately, MAYAHEM Temple is an effective, if not particularly interesting, introductory level. It showcases and familiarizes the player with numerous design elements and moves that are used extensively throughout the rest of the game. More important, however, is its initial linearity. This aspect of MAYAHEM Temple is an outlier compared to the immediate, sprawling openness of nearly all of the game's other levels. In effect, it eases players into the most significant change made between Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, which is the overall structure and scale of its levels. Expectations for video game sequels tend to be quite varied. Finding the right balance between making things new and keeping them the same can be difficult. One aspect that many players expect is a reasonable increase in the overall scale of the game from prequel to sequel, and Banjo-Tooie certainly does this. Although many of Banjo-Kazooie's levels were non-linear and contained different subsections, none of them come close to the sheer size and complexity of Banjo-Tooie's. This difference is made hugely evident simply by comparing the second levels in each game. Treasure Trove Cove is a bright, open beach level that appears much larger than it actually is, and its abundance of landmarks and the addition of flying make it simple to navigate. Glitter Gulch Mine, on the other hand, is an enormous and at times cramped level that can be downright labyrinthine. Even with signs posted throughout the main area, it can be fairly easy to lose track of where certain sections are in relation to others. The biggest issue is simply the physical layout. The bright piles of colored ore could perhaps serve as a useful way to navigate, but the player's view is often blocked, and the interweaving subsections have little in the way of signage, often resulting in navigation by trial and error. As a result, even when the player is familiar with the level, there tends to be a lot more aimless wandering. This is a problem in a few other levels as well, but Glitter Gulch Mine is a particularly strong example. The increased size and complexity of levels isn't always a negative point, however. Witchy World is another massive level, but is made far easier to navigate and understand, as it's separated into highly distinct sections. Its layout is also centralized around the big top, making it easier to orient oneself. The larger worlds can also help to create a sense of atmosphere. Jolly Roger's Lagoon features a large network of underwater areas, and the feeling of exploring the ocean's depths simply wouldn't be achievable if the level were constrained to the size of one from Banjo-Kazooie. Even putting these specific examples aside, however, it's clear that the impacts of the changes in level structure weren't overlooked by the developers. The presence of warp pads near landmarks common to each level make navigation much simpler. Unlike Banjo-Kazooie, every distinct area is also given a name, which appears on screen every time a room is loaded. This may seem like a minor point, but it's an enormously helpful inclusion in levels with many similar-looking areas, such as HAILFIRE Peaks and Grunty Industries. Certain aspects from Banjo-Kazooie have also been sped up and streamlined in Tooie. The dancing animation for collecting a Jiggy has been removed. The increase in swimming speed, along with a hidden, even faster swimming technique, makes navigating underwater less of a chore. In its shift to a larger scale, Tooie even addresses the most glaring issue from Banjo-Kazooie with regard to musical notes, as notes are no longer reset upon leaving a level or dying. The notes in general have been heavily scaled back, but on that point I feel that Tooie may have taken things a bit further than it needed to. Musical notes have been condensed into bundles worth 5 notes each, and a single treble clef worth 20 notes. The reduction from 100 collectible notes per level down to a mere 17 limits the ability of notes to be placed in a way that guides the player or works in tandem with the open level design. Their importance for progression and puzzle solving through the learning of new moves means that they often can't be hidden either. It's clear that the change was made owing to the sometimes enormous size of Tooie's levels. It would certainly be annoying to have to scour some of these levels to find 1 or 2 missed notes, but it may have been a better idea to use multiple note denominations. For example, having 30 individual notes, 10 of the 5-note nests, and a single treble clef would have allowed the notes to take a more prominent role, while still bringing the number of collectibles down to a more reasonable amount. By making the value of each denomination correspond with the difficulty of reaching it, it would make collecting them more meaningful and noteworthy. Some interesting general design shifts also arise in the move from prequel to sequel. In Banjo-Kazooie, a large number of jiggies in each level were simply sitting out in the open. All that was required of the player was to find and reach them. Tooie, on the other hand, has a far greater proportion of jiggies that require the player to help NPCs, solve puzzles, or play minigames, and some of these can be extremely involved. While some of these minigames are a bit too lengthy, and all of them are rather easy, it still strikes me as a good idea to introduce this kind of variety in the core gameplay. Generally speaking, although there are fewer jiggies in Banjo-Tooie, each one tends to take a lot more work to collect. From what I can see, whether this change is a positive or negative one depends entirely on the player's perspective. Personally, I feel it can be more fulfilling to put in more effort and solve a complicated problem than it is to simply find a jiggy on a platform or in some hidden corner. On the other hand, there's certainly an imbalance in the amount of required effort from jiggy to jiggy. Some take less than a minute, while others in the very same level can take the better part of an hour, and I can understand the frustration of spending such a varying amount of time on different tasks when each yield the exact same reward. Either way, this change in design still feels like a fairly logical consequence of the increase in scale, and I think it ultimately adds to the feeling of Tooie being a larger and more complex game, for better or worse. On that same note, another major departure from Banjo-Kazooie's level design is an abundance of collectibles that require traveling between worlds. This isn't a bad idea in theory. It provides a little extra longevity to levels, as unlike Banjo-Kazooie, there's no penalty for leaving a level without collecting everything. It lends the game world a certain amount of cohesion, but the execution is sometimes lacking. The player may see a jiggy just out of reach or behind a barrier, and search the level looking for a way to reach it, only to find that it's only accessible through an interworld link from a completely different level. On many occasions, the player is presented with a problem that can't be solved until reaching a certain world or learning a certain move later in the game, but there's little to no indication that this is the case. The player is instead left to fumble around, trying every non-solution they can think of. Ideally, after the player learns the required move, they would have a moment of realization and return to finish the puzzle. The problem is that the prize is almost always placed too teasingly within reach, or in one of the worst instances, in the same room that a completely irrelevant move is learned. It would be far more effective to place entrances to areas out of reach rather than jiggies themselves. Then, the previously off-limits area could require a more complex or difficult use of the new move. By far, the most troublesome aspect of these multi-world jiggies is ambiguity. For example, 2 pigs in Jolly Roger's lagoon want to swim in a pool, but the water is polluted and too cold. The steps to fixing the latter problem are utterly obtuse, and the actual solution is completely unsatisfying. This is perhaps the worst jiggy in the game. The pollution can be fixed by entering the faucet that's dumping the wastewater and simply turning off the pump. Warming up the water is another story, however. The presence of a second faucet seems to indicate that the player needs to interact with it in some way, but this ends up being fruitless. The only indication that the jiggy requires travel to another world is a single piece of dialogue from Banjo, and it's an extremely vague one that might be missed entirely. Much later in the game, the player reaches HAILFIRE peaks. After learning a technique that allows Banjo to enter hot water that would normally cause damage, the player will likely attempt to press this switch near the beginning of the level. When they do so, the pig from Jolly Roger's lagoon informs the player that the water is too hot for their pool. I'm not even sure where to begin with this. First of all, the switch can only be pressed by Banjo on his own. The technique allowing Banjo to enter such a body of water is learned in the very same area, and is used to collect 2 other objects in a similar heated pool. It seems then that the switch is a very natural call to action to use this new move, but it ends up simply teasing the player by revealing the solution and simultaneously denying it to them. Furthermore, the suggestion that the water needs to be cooled ends up being highly misleading. Half of Hailfire Peaks is coated in ice and snow, so it's natural for a player to assume that something within the level might be able to cool off the water. This could very likely lead to even more wasted time searching for a solution when the answer is, once again, in another world entirely. In fact, the solution is found in the very last of the main levels, when the player attempts to drop an ice cube onto the icy side of Hailfire Peaks. He lands in the pool of water instead, melting to death and cooling it in the process. I can't deny the dark humor of this, but it's frustrating to me on multiple levels. First of all, now that the water is cooled, Banjo and Kazooie are able to swim in it regularly without consequence. The water has to be cooled to this point before the switch can be pressed. As such, the switch indicating that the player needs to be Banjo on his own isn't just pointless, it's counterintuitive. By simply using a Banjo and Kazooie switch instead, the text that could potentially cause so much confusion about needing to cool down the water could have been completely removed. It seems as if the switch was originally intended to be the end of the puzzle, but another step was added without consideration as to how it might mislead players. Perhaps worst of all is how much of a non-puzzle this ends up being. Generally, a developer wants to challenge the player and allow them to intuit the solution to a problem on their own, by making use of the information given to them. In this case, the only way to heat up the pool is to bumble into the solution accidentally across multiple worlds. It's mildly amusing in its circuitousness, but it's unabashedly poor game design. The developer presents a complicated problem, places the solution near the end of the game, and simply hands it to the player without requiring any real effort or thought. There are no logical observations or connections for the player to make, and what little information is provided is often vague or completely misleading. Thankfully, this Jiggy represents the absolute worst form of Banjo-Tooie's large-scale puzzle solving, and the other multi-world Jiggies, although sometimes convoluted, are far better in terms of design. The problem of ambiguity and poor conveyance isn't limited to the multi-world Jiggies, however. Even the teaching of new moves occasionally has its issues. This is almost always due to the fact that Jam Jars instructs the player in the form of rhyming military cadences. On numerous occasions, the purpose of a move, or even the controls needed to activate it, are omitted, presumably because they wouldn't fit the rhyme scheme. It's possible to get a clearer, non-rhyming explanation by talking to Jam Jars again, but the developers obviously should have put more thought into this. Some of the hint signposts are almost insulting in their directness, practically spelling out the solution to a puzzle or simply listing the locations of certain objects. On the other hand, some puzzles are so vague that it seems the corresponding signpost is necessary to solve it. Some obstacles and terrain are occasionally inconsistent in their presentation, with some destructible objects lacking the distinctive crack or damaged appearance, and the steepness of slopes sometimes becoming rather arbitrary. Although not quite as major of an issue, the fact that every single minigame that makes use of a color-coded point system takes the time to laboriously detail the amount of points that each color is worth starts to get a little annoying by the 6th or 7th time it's seen. These conveyance issues aren't game-breaking by any means, but in a sequel that features such an increase in complexity, a stronger focus on ensuring the player knows what to do without necessarily spelling it out to them would have been appreciated.